Thank you very much for having me here. I'm Professor Luis Botella at the University of Malaga. It is a pleasure for me to take part in this online seminar on the Global South and Bandung 70th anniversary. I would like to thank especially to Professor Mohamed Ben Sheikh for inviting me to take part in this prestigious event, and I'm very happy to be sharing this presentation with you all. My presentation is a consideration of Bantu from a long perspective, in the sense of how it has been um, uh, the historical causes that could lead into this event for East Asian countries. I am not discovering anything new when I say that the Bandung Conference has been on the shoulders of the decolonization movement in Asia. There has been many nationalist movements, popular movements in Asia before 1945, fighting for people's right against colonial powers. The native political activism led many of those movements, and obviously among them, communism was a driving force. The general context of the Second World War, in particular the particular consequence of the Japanese expansion in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, led to many of the European colonial powers without enough resources to keep their situation of domination in the region, and also changes inside European societies and North American societies led them into sometimes peaceful decolonization process. Some others are very bloody progress. In addition to this general background, we need to also consider the Cold War situation in 1955, to think about how this all affected for the participation of East Asian states in the Bantu conference. And in connection to that, what was the role of the US policy in Asia regarding it? Again, in order to just set up the general context, as you all I'm sure know, the main idea of this conference was to provide an alternative platform for decolonizing nations or decolonized nations to promote for the right to be independent beyond the limits and requirements of the Cold War politics, meaning to be an ally of the US or USSR. In that sense, US policy in East Asia in the 50s was highly focused on the contention of communism, many times through the support of bloody regimes. In that sense, I would like to consider the long perspective of East Asian nations regarding the colonization of the region, and in order to analyze in a bit more of a detail what was their starting point to consider the participation in Bandung and the general role in the conference. Um, as it's well known, 19th century was the century of European North American expansion throughout the world, making larger part of the world colonial regimes. In East Asia in particular, for the situation of the Qing Empire, the Tokugawa regime, and the Joseon Dynasty, it confronted what were organic economies. It means economies limited to the biological cycle of plants against fully inorganic economies like the UK or the US, in which their production system was unleashed thanks to the a new source of energy such as coal and the energetic possibilities that could offer for their economic development. In that sense, though, we need to think that the process of interconnection that these regimes were involved during the 19th century were not an automatic introduction into a perfect Westphalian system in which nations behave um, as independent actors, even though they subscribe international treaties. In this sense, I would like to call upon Professor Hamashita's theory, in which he described the period of the unequal treaties signing as a moment in which um, it a multilateral imperialism was developed in the region, in the sense that through the clause of the most favored nation, many colonial powers were engaged in uh, sustaining relationships with what we would call quote unquote pre-modern state of the Qing Empire, Tokugawa, or the Joseon. But at the same time, they, in many senses, cooperate together to keep their privileges and to keep and to sustain the state that granted those privileges in East Asia. In that sense, we see not a colonization process such as that of Africa, in which external powers, European powers mostly, control the territory directly through a colonial administrative structure. Here we will see how the native state continued exercising sovereignty, although forced to provide certain privileges agreed or forced, better said, on those treaties. And these multilateral imperialism start changing when Japan start also asserting a more active and violent relation with their neighbors. Once Japanese economic development reached a certain level, but more specifically when the Japanese army reached a certain level of modernization, we would say. At the end of the 19th century, we will see a more assertive Japanese state, Meiji state, which start using regional crises for their advantage to assert their domination and their interest in the region. And after some point, we will see how the Japanese empire start fabricating those crises for their own advantage. If we look at the main events, we will see how this trend start changing or was inaugurated with the First Sino-Japanese War that led to the Treaty of Shimonoseki, then the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, then the First World War that led to the proclamation of the 21 demands to the Chinese Republic, the Republic of China. And then the economic crisis of 1999 led to first the Mukden incident that led the Japanese Empire into the colonization of Manchuria and the establishment of Manchukuo as a formally independent regime, but really a puppet regime controlled by Tokyo. And then from Manchukuo into the Second Japanese War in 1937. Um, I mentioned in particular the Japanese aggression because it led to a change of the imperialistic and colonizing dynamics of East Asia because uh, where other nations, the British, the Americans for sure, French, were participating into this multilateral imperialism, the Japanese expansion in East Asia aimed at an hegemonic control of regions and access to those markets, trying to push out any other power. We saw first such a strategy by pushing out of Korea, the Qing Empire, and then also the Russian power. We saw since that moment um, a more assertive policy against the Republic of China in different stages. I would like to also mention at this point how the Russo-Japanese War in the colonized world was perceived, specifically, for example, in India or in Turkey, um, as a symbol of resistance against European powers, as it was so, at least for a brief moment of time, how a nation was able to defeat one of the European nations in a feat of arms and assert their own dominance or power against, which led to many intellectuals at the time throughout the colonized world to think about also the possibility of leading successful military revolts or military actions against European colonizing powers. And it's this context in which I would like to present the decolonizing struggle of East Asian countries before 1945, because that struggle created the conditions for the post-war regimes to become, and also it would set up this particular interest to support other decolonizing activities. So if we look into the history of China since 1900 to 1945, what we will see is that the collapse of the Qing regime since the Boxer Rebellion first, and then the nationalist uprising of the Kuomintang led to the First Republic of China. But that First Republic, and more specifically after the death of Yuan Shikai, um, led into a complete fragmentation of the administrative bureaucratic apparatus of the state, creating a vacuum of power inside China that was taken advantage by all sorts of warlords that use it to create new power bases throughout China. It was specifically that vacuum of power, the one that Japan used to impose into a much larger country their demands shamelessly. But it is also that context of constant colon imperialistic aggression that led not just to the Kuomintang as a political party and political movement, but also rise the communist, the success, the popularity of communism as an alternative political way into to confront those imperial powers. The Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921, meaning after First World War and after that the Russian Revolution succeedingly established a Soviet government in Russia, telling also to the world that a communist revolution was a viable way to achieve independence and a regime. For colonized movements, communism will also be understood and read as a potentially viable way to achieve their decolonization and to confront the imperialistic powers. Let's never forget that communism, in their own discourse, has a strong anti-imperialist discourse, despite what Stalin later did with the USSR. So it is that context in which we saw the confrontation in China between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, which unraveled into an early alliance, also brokered by the USSR, with this idea of first support a bourgeois regime in order to create the conditions for a communist revolution. However, that alliance was rather unstable, and when the Kuomintang started being successful taking control over the greater part of China, we saw how the alliance was broken. Kuomintang started purging and pursuing the Chinese communist, and led later on to the Long March in 1934 and the Xi'an incident. So actually, it's important to remember that without the forced trust between communists and the Kuomintang in the 30s, due to the Second Sino-Japanese War, the invasion of Japan over China, the Kuomintang would haven't stopped pressuring the communists in China, and considering their means and their resources at the time, they could have been created a much different situation. But the events led into this trust, this untrusted trust between both of them, and later on to fight. I'm not going to say together, but to fight at the same time the Japanese Empire without fighting too much between themselves. Later on, we will see how the defeat of the Japanese Empire led to the resumption of hostilities between Kuomintang and the Communist Party. In Korea, the situation was different in the sense that the colonization of the peninsula led to a very harsh Japanese regime during what is known today as the military government between 1910 and 1919, that at the same time provoked a massive declaration of independence in 1919 on the belief that Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech would also apply to Koreans, and that the US would support the Korean independence. When that was evident that the US wouldn't do so, and after a very massive crackdown on the Korean independence movement, we saw how the Japanese Empire tried to change their way of ruling the peninsula without really relinquish any control on the peninsula, allowing some sort of political activity. It was in that context when we saw the organization of Korean society, politically speaking, in two different camps. One trying to work within the limits of the Japanese Empire and trying to support Korean nationalism without really trying to foster yet any independent movement within, although they may support some of the independentist fighters outside Korea. And the other camp was the radical progressive camp, dealing or trying to support more radical measures. Among them, we saw the organization of the Chinese with the Communist Party of Korea in 1925, allied with the Chinese Communist Party, which is also quite relevant. With the mobilization of Korea for the Japanese war effort, we saw a crackdown on many of those associations or activities, and many of the Korean freedom fighters had to act from the outside of the peninsula, as it was impossible for them to carry on any meaningful activity within due to the political pressure of the Japanese colonial system. In that sense, we saw the inauguration of the provisional government of the Republic of Korea in Shanghai in 1919, and tried to coordinate and centralize the political resistance in favor of Korean independence outside of the peninsula. But the truth is that despite some international support, the range of action was rather limited. And also, despite the mythology of North Korean regime, the communist activities in Manchuria were rather limited in their effect, although there were many guerrilla fighters active in the area. So in that sense, we see the region how it was first had a long and sad experience with colonization. We had several movements trying to resist from the state institutions when possible, or from non-state institutions such as the Communist Party. And we see also this tension between communist options of resistance and non-communist options of resistance. In China, we had the Kuomintang as a non-state and non-communist option against the Chinese Communist Party, which ended up developing a state-like apparatus to control the area of extension. In Korea, we saw also the communist and non-communist option, but at the same time, neither in control of any state apparatus. And Japan, we saw how they were actively crushing any communist option of alternative politics within the empire and the colonial empire. After 1945 and the defeat of Japan, we saw how despite uh, despite the absence of a clear political agenda, we saw a rapid development of Cold War politics in every single country of East Asia. In China, the civil war on hold since the Xi'an incident restarted rapidly. And this time, the Communist Party had the support of the USSR and the Manchurian platform of operations, donated by the USSR introduction of the war. In Korea, the society also rapidly polarized, also supported by the national division after liberation, with the northern half of the peninsula under USSR control and the southern half under US control. And Japan started a long process supported by the US of demilitarization and democratization, thinking that the situation in the region would support broadly a non-communist option of decolonization or state development, better said, and thinking then that they will have enough time to really demilitarize and democratize Japanese society. However, the evolution of the Chinese Civil War and the succeeding communist regime in that war led into a reevaluation of US politics in the area, and led into a much more, into the contention of communism policy that we know now. The greatest example of such policy is how the US stopped many of the programs to break down the economic Zaibatsu uh, stopped many of the more radical proposals for Japan and uh, invested to support and to maintain a South Korean regime allied to the US and in opposition to the communist regime in the north. Um, so, in that sense, and from this broader perspective, even if China, uh, in broader terms, and Korea could have been rather supportive of the Bandung conference, the fact is that the Cold War politics were highly ingrained into their movements in relation to Bandung. Uh, the Popular Republic of China was one of the greatest supporters of the conference in 1955, but I think it would be useful to consider their participation as a way of reasserting their position internationally after US and many other countries actually supported the Republic of China. Uh, we know step one. It was also an attempt to reinvigorate the Popular Republic of China's position vis-a-vis other communist regimes in the region. North Korea owed much of their success during the Korean War to Chinese support. And let's never forget that Vietnam in this moment and the Viet Cong, led by Ho Chi Minh, were fighting against the French first and the US in their decolonization wars. Um, in Korea, the South Korean regime had to or kept into the alliance with the US and tried to create a counter alliance in the region against the Bandung spirit in support or in alliance with the Republic of China and the Philippines, which, well, with some level of collaboration among these regimes. And the North Korean regime uh, was trying to maneuver during the 50s in between the USSR and the PRC as the greatest communist powers in the region. Um, Interesting is also the position of Japan within this context, because as an aggressor during the Second World War, many of the countries that participated in the Bandung Conference, Indonesia, for example, many areas, even India to some point, still had a distinctive memory of Japanese aggression in the so, region. As I was saying, with Japan, Japan's participation in Bandung was, on the one hand, trying to mendel their situation in the region and trying to, some scholars have talked about the coming back to Asia of Japan, trying to reestablish some connections with regimes in the region. But also, it was encouraged by the US to actually take part in the event, to keep an eye on the potential developments of a regional alliance, considering that it was also some sort of reaction to the organization of the military alliance in Europe, the Pact of Warsaw and the NATO. So, in that sense, even though the Bandung Conference tried to present itself as a reaction to the Cold War regime and trying to present some alternative perspective by involving and presenting harshly the reality of decolonization. If we look at the East Asian states taking part of it or reacting to it, it's impossible to separate their activities or their understanding from Cold War politics on the raw. Thank you very much for their attention, and I hope this has been of their interest.